Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled Global Order in Crisis Mode, Coping Strategies for the West. My name is David Deissner. I'm the Executive Director of Atlantik-Brücke, and on behalf of our institution and the American Council in Germany, I would like to welcome you to this digital panel. It's part of the virtual German-American conference, which this year we are hosting as a series of joint webinars with experts and policymakers from both sides of the Atlantic. And we are very pleased that many members of and alumni of both organizations have joined us. And we would like to encourage you to participate in our discussion. Please use the chat function of Zoom, and I will try to include as many questions as possible. But first of all, I would like to briefly introduce our guests. First of all, Ambassador Victoria Nuland. She's joining us from Washington. She's Senior Counselor at the Albright Stonebridge Group, a global strategic advisory and commercial diplomacy firm based in Washington, D.C. She's also a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution, Distinguished Practitioner in Grand Strategy at Yale University, and a member of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. She looks back on a remarkable career in diplomacy as a US diplomat for 32 years. Ambassador Nuland served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs from 2013 until 2017 under President Obama and Secretary Kerry. She was State Department spokesperson during Secretary Hillary Clinton's tenure and US Ambassador to NATO, of course, during President George W. Bush's second term. Warm welcome to you, Ambassador, dear Victoria. It's an honor to have you on the call.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here with our friends at the Council.
And our speaker on the German side, joining us from Berlin, is Omid Nouripour. He's a member of the board of Atlantik-Brücke. He has been a member of the German Federal Parliament since 2006 for the German Green Party. He's the party's spokesman on foreign affairs, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Defense Committee, and the Committee on Human Rights. Omid, great to have you as well.
Thank you for having me.
Unfortunately, our chairman, Sigmar Gabriel, who was announced to take part in today's call, cannot take part due to an urgent and unforeseen obligation. He's very sorry for that and sends his warm regards. We are very sorry for this change in our lineup today, but are even more grateful that you, Victoria, and Omid have joined us. So, Victoria, if I may start off with a first question to you. When partners are faced with a crisis, there are two possible reactions. Everyone looks after himself or herself primarily, or one uses the crisis as an opportunity to join forces and work together. Based on what we are seeing right now, how stable is the transatlantic partnership in this time of global crisis? Is it functioning?
Well, first, David, thanks to the Council, thanks to all of you, and to my friend Omid for joining. It's a great opportunity to talk to our friends across the Atlantic. David was wrong. I am not in Washington. I am on the North Carolina coast, and I thought in honor of this transatlantic conversation, I'd give you a picture of the Atlantic from outside my windows here today. So anyway, great to be with you. Look, over the medium term, I continue to have great confidence in the transatlantic relationship because we need each other, because we do not maintain our security, our prosperity, our values, or our health without each other. However, I think it's relatively well known that I am extremely critical of what's happened over the last 3 years, the way the fabric of the relationship has been torn, the way we have stressed our security ties, our economic ties, that from the White House too often we hear criticism of allies and we hear coddling of authoritarians and dictators, and that has continued. And that this America First approach to the world is increasingly becoming America alone. And we see what that brings for my country, let alone for the transatlantic relationship through this awful period of the COVID-19 epidemic, where we have one of the highest levels of virus, and we are not getting our arms around it because we are trying to go it alone. And we're not even very successfully going it alone, as you know. The president has failed to provide national leadership. He has failed to use our federal system to convene governors and local officials to work together. And, you know, our results by the numbers are abysmal, particularly as compared to a country like Germany, which has deployed under the Chancellor's leadership, a really federal approach. I noticed that every time she makes a policy statement, she has just met with all of the provincial leaders before she's made her decisions, and you have based your choices firmly on science, on testing, and you've been able to harness national and local power to accelerate your ability to deliver services, whether it is protective gear, whether it is testing, whether it is economic relief. So my grave concern is that we certainly in the United States, and we'll see how the US voters appreciate this in November, we certainly in the United States would have done far better in this crisis if we had been working with allies and partners on everything from stockpiling medical equipment back in December and January, putting money jointly into virus research, into testing, and if we had coordinated our fiscal and monetary stimulus as we did in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, across both Republican and Democratic administrations. And then more broadly, the US has, I believe, a very strong track record of global leadership since the end of World War II. And we've been not only absent from the field, we've been completely selfish. And selfish in not even doing basic things like dropping the tariffs that we have on Europe at this time so that we can all work together on economic recovery. So I am in a very critical place, but I do not think that this is irreversible, nor do I think that we have frayed these relationships or the institutions that bind us to the point of breaking if we get an electoral change here in November. If we have 4 more years of this from the United States, I think it will be very, very difficult. And I hope we'll talk about how Europe can then really take up the banner of defending liberalism, because that's going to be necessary. I will pause there.
Thank you so much, Victoria. If I may just pass on to you, Omid, what is your view on the current situation, with a particular view on the transatlantic partnership? As in Germany, we say Krise als Chance, crisis as an opportunity. Is it possible in your view that, in particular with regard to cooperation and health and global aid, that, this crisis might hold the potential for strengthening our transatlantic ties? Or do we just see, the manifestation of national egoism here?
There is a very famous quote, I think, given by President Roosevelt saying, never miss a good crisis. And of course, and I just can refer to that, what Victoria just said and underline that. Obviously, the opportunity now we have to take is of course the question of cooperation. We're seeing that researchers all across the globe are saying that they can deliver a vaccine in 18 months. We've never had that before on any other diseases we got. We never had such a clear timetable and a prognosis of getting vaccines that fast. So it shows that definitely it's good to cooperate. It's obvious that the transatlantic relations are unbreakable because they're about people-to-people relations. It's about civil societies who are entangled. The Germans know that we had a huge benefit of this friendship and partnership for the last decades. Of course, we know that there are huge challenges, and to be honest, the challenges never have been that big, and never have been that heavy. The load of the challenges is which is put at the bridge across the pond is huge these days, but it was even before the pandemic. And then now we have a worldwide crisis, which is, of course, coupled to the competition of the systems we already have. And this moment, it's obvious that we have to take the banner, as Victoria said, to pick up the banner of liberalism and democracy against those who try to prove that their efficiency of the Chinese system is the better way to deal with that with that kind of crisis, which is definitely not. There are a lot of proofs on that. We could maybe spend a few words on that later on also. But it's obvious that countries like China and of course Russia, we can see in the middle of Europe in these days, in Belarus, they are not able to deal with the crisis. And this is why it would be much more important, not only for the health, for the sake of our people, but also for the power projection of democracies, having a United States which is delivering, and the rest is already has been said by Victoria.
Thank you, Omid. Let us maybe open up the scope a little bit and look at the geopolitical implications. Victoria, back in summer last year, you in an interview with the German newspaper Handelsblatt, you suggested that authoritarian regimes were increasingly gaining influence. You warned that they were undermining the rules of the international order. Now, in these days, it's often claimed that the coronavirus plays into the hands of autocrats, since they can impose restrictions and control resources more easily by virtue of their constitution. They are supposedly better able to deal with a crisis of this magnitude than democracies. How would you assess the impact of the corona crisis on the global influence of autocratic regimes?
Well, first of all, David, let me just say that picking up on what we could, should, would be doing together as a liberal democratic family, I think we want to look not simply at getting back to where we were, we want to look at building back better together. And this is going to segue into how to think about the authoritarian narrative. But, we should be doing things like, as we stimulate our economies, how do we ensure that we are protecting small and medium-sized business? How do we ensure we are protecting the middle class and using this stimulus to help close the income inequality gaps that have led to a fertile ground for populists and that we saw even before the virus? How do we invest with some of this stimulus money in broadband and in 5G that is made by the democracies? That also helps stimulate middle class economy because more people can engage in innovation and technology, et cetera, particularly at a time where we may not be going to work in the traditional way for at least a year. How do we build back better in green technology? Can we give tax incentives, et cetera, for those industries and manufacturing entities that take this opportunity to come off of coal and get on cleaner sources of energy? As big EU is thinking about doing itself, if we were working together, we could be using this stimulus and this moment to coordinate how we do that. But it's also important to coordinate how we defeat the authoritarian narrative that they were doing it better before the virus and now they're doing it better, even better. I think the Russians are having a hard time making that narrative right now, at least as the virus is rocking across the country from Moscow and from Petersburg. But the Chinese are working very hard, whether it is the export of protective gear, whether it is trying to accelerate their own science, whether it is claiming that they had a better handle on their citizenry and were able to lock them down. But the authoritarians have built-in deficiencies and negatives that we don't have. For example, they lie to their citizens. And both in China and in Russia, we see authoritarian leaders lying to their citizens about the effect of this virus. And that severs the trust and makes it harder for them to control their populations. They also don't innovate like we do when we stimulate innovation. So combination of US and Europe together, we have at least 10 lines of virus vaccine testing going on now among us. And I predict that we will beat the authoritarians at coming to those solutions. But how do we turn that scientific collaboration and learning and stimulation of innovation into next generation health acceleration for our populations and get more citizens into the health economy as a way to innovate as well. So I could go on and on about this. I think the authoritarians, and particularly the Chinese, have a narrative that they will pursue. But again, we defeat ourselves in the democratic world when we don't work together, when we don't harness the power that we have, whether it is as innovators, whether it is as supporters of our citizens and in conversation and compact with our citizens, whether it is being able to keep our economies strong and vibrant and recovering well together. So, if we pull our act together, if we work together, we have all the tools in our bag, not only to come out of this better and stronger, but certainly to put the lie to this narrative that authoritarians somehow deliver better for citizens. They don't, and we know it, but we haven't been delivering, at least we haven't, well enough for our own to make that case.
Thank you so much. Omid, over to you. Of course, in Germany, we also had a vivid debate on how to balance our democratic values and the opportunities within tech, in particular with regard to tracking and developing, implementing apps that would allow tracking the spread of the virus. How do you see this debate in Germany unfolding? Is it, is there a new twist to that debate, given the crisis that we are facing at the moment, since data protection was always one of the key values really in Germany, and certainly more of a sensitive issue here as it is in the US, I would suspect.
And still is, but this is not an obstacle for such an app, and it's obvious that we're waiting for that all the time, and I hope that it definitely comes very soon, so we can open more and more part of public life. Of course, it's obvious. We can see it in a lot of countries that tracing and tracking is key for reopening public. And this is what we hope and pray and work on that all the time. But that doesn't mean that we have to just push away data protection. There are a lot of ways, and this is the debate we have in a lot of democracies. There are a lot of ways to combine that. And you can see statements of even from Chaos Computer Club saying that, of course, there are some conditions they're elaborating and then referring to, but of course also they are supporting such an app coming, and I hope that it finally comes.
Victoria, how is that?
Again, David, I think this is an area where we should have been working together, even under the Obama administration, much more closely. We did work together when the EU instituted GDPR. The US had intensive consultations both with nation states and with the EU, and the way your EU legislation came out, I think, was a market leader for the democratic world, and was certainly something that we can and could accommodate, and I think we should be picking up some of the lessons there. But more broadly, this whole technological universe is what gave the initial promise of making the democracy stronger, and then morphed into a tool that was better deployed by the authoritarians, whether it was a tool of controlling their own citizens or spreading disinformation or infecting our democracies and getting into our national conversations, or as a tool of attack on critical infrastructure, et cetera. So here again, we have a common problem. We need to pull our act together and look at appropriate regulation of the tech industry, appropriate monitoring of the ability to use these technologies to undercut democracy, to undercut citizen freedom, et cetera, and come up with common protocols, as we did, unfortunately, frankly, during the Cold War with regard to the trade and commerce and other high technologies. And at the same time, continue to stimulate our own innovation so we stay ahead on these kinds of things. But, tech appropriately used is the answer to economic recovery, to closing income inequality, to continuing to innovate and protect our citizens. But we have to work on these problems, whether it's privacy problems, whether it is the ability to abuse these technologies, or whether it is the national security aspects of it.
Thank you. And let me just emphasize that there are already a number of solutions when it comes to tracking the virus, which are in accordance with GDPR, as they only measure proximity and not geolocalization, for example. So let's hope that the US and Germany or Europe altogether will find ways to cooperate on common standards and regulation. So maybe let us focus a little bit more on China. We have already touched upon the role of China. There is actually a question now from our viewers. And the question goes as follows: if we manage to find a vaccine, that's fantastic, and then we have to manufacture it. And we know that pharmaceutical manufacturing is heavily dependent on facilities in India and China. What are the consequences of this? So this question is not directed to any one in particular. Would you like to comment on that? Maybe Omid or?
Yeah, sure. I can start, and Victoria can correct me now. First, I think India is not a problem. You know, of course, the Modi is not the nicest person I've ever seen in my life, but at the end of the day, India is a democracy. Second, let me come back to the competition of the systems I mentioned before. One of the reasons why the pandemic is now a global one, and it's a pandemic, the first ever, is that the system of the Communist Party in China is just unable to phase through. That means that someone in Wuhan has a huge problem and he just does not dare to tell that to his bosses in Beijing. This is the core of the system that you have to deliver. There is no failure culture there. You can survive within the system, within the party. This is, I think, something we should talk about, because it's important for the narratives. And maybe I can give you later on a couple of figures on how China is saving the world, and the number of the masks, and what does it mean what they're doing there. Just one, and I could add a lot of later on. They delivered. You saw all of this propaganda. Mass deliveries they brought to Italy, to Serbia, and a lot of other places, and we saw the reaction, which was very people of very, very shaken. Even the mayor of Firenze wanted his people to hug Chinese. We saw Vucic going around kissing the Chinese flag, saying that Mr. Xi is the only friend his country has. Just two. First one is, you're talking about a recovery fund for the European Union, including more than 1 trillion million euros. Of course, this could be a help for Italy. What the Chinese delivered to Italy has been 200,000 masks. 200,000 masks is maybe enough for 2 days for the medical staffers in Lombardy. This is ridiculous. But they said, hey, look at that, we save Italy. What Mr. Vucic, by the way, didn't mention was the delivery of the Chinese has been paid by the European Union. So the question is, why is their show so effective? The answer is because we are not telling to the people what we are doing. We are not picking up this ball of this huge game named power projection, which is part of the competition of our systems. I think we need cooperation with China. They're not only in a question of a vaccine, but we also need containment. And I think these are the two headlines we always had to work on together, of course, with our American friends in China. We didn't enough. We didn't do that enough for the last years because of a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is the hesitation of the American administration to cooperate on this. But it's also about the Europeans not standing up and saying that there are things they bring into a cooperation with the Americans, how we can deal with China when it comes to cooperation and containment. But at the end of the day, we see that Chinese now are trying to withdraw from any kind of funding of a common development of a vaccine, because they think the day after they could have a huge benefit if they have it by themselves. And of course, they are afraid and they are scared to death by the perspective that the first country who would bring a vaccine to the market could be Taiwan. So this is why they it would be a dream, by the way. But this is why they do not cooperate on this. And these are the issues we have to talk about much louder.
Victoria, it's of course not a secret that many Americans actually on both sides of the aisle are not very happy with the German approach towards China. Of course, you know, there are huge economic implications on the German side, and it has often been criticized that Germany is not clear in its positions, that it doesn't really know its adversaries or isn't clearly naming them, that we don't have a clear course with regard to the 5G question and many other issues. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit, how that now plays out in the current debate in the Democratic Party, but also in the Republican Party? Is there really a shared understanding that Germany does not have a clear course in its China policy, and that this might actually be a threat to the transatlantic partnership?
Well, first of all, I would just say for your German audience something that they already know. It is I think one of the only bipartisan issues in national security in the United States is concern about China. And frankly, there is concern across the political spectrum, and it predated the pandemic, but the pandemic has obviously made China into a public enemy, and you see the Trump administration trying to accelerate that. So you are going to have a tough US-China policy no matter who is elected in November. The question is, can it be an effective China policy? And from where I'm sitting, it will only be an effective China policy if it is tightly and well coordinated with allies, and not just European allies, but also with Asian allies, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Australia, India, of course, if we can get there. And you know, this is within our capacity to do. It is not in anybody's interest to create a permanent enemy of China or to try to cut China off and isolate it completely from the world. You know, our romantic strategy that integration of China into the global system would make it a responsible stakeholder has failed, but that doesn't mean that together we can't get tougher and more coordinated about the left-right limits of Chinese behavior in the international system. So what does that mean? That means essentially working together on what security moves are acceptable and what are unacceptable, and our united position in countering moves that are unacceptable, whether it's threatening of Taiwan or closing of the straits or any of those things. Similarly, I am completely where Omid is, that, you know, 2 years ago, Europeans paraded through Washington and said, let us work together on the economic, copyright, intellectual property problems that we have with China. Don't tariff us, let's together tariff China. If we had done that, we would have had a much more coordinated and united front. We could have each borne a bit of the financial burden of trying to stop these massive state subsidies and stealing of Western technology and IP and you know, market fairness, and we might be well further along than we are. We can still get back to that kind of a system. And similarly, you know, a China that's willing to cooperate in international organizations, as we had good cooperation because we put the hard work in and because we were unified around the Paris climate talks. We need to get back to that. We can't have a global climate policy without China. Similarly, if we're not competitive, if we don't have a free and democratic alternative to Huawei 5G, of course they're going to dominate. And then the final piece is, for a lot of the world that needs our assistance and support, if China is able to pour money into Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia with no rules and with rapacious debt standards, et cetera, and we do nothing about it and we offer no alternative for the development of these countries, then we're going to reap what we sow there. So again, we need a coordinated approach to things like Belt and Road. It's not beyond our capability to do that. I think it will require a much more intensive and comprehensive and clear conversation across the Atlantic. For example, in the 5G world, is there such a thing as the core of a system versus the periphery? How do you define that? How do you protect the core? We've done this before in terms of blocking technology to the Soviet Union, but being able to maintain some commercial relationship and some and our innovation base. So we just need to get back to those first principles in the way we approach it. I hope that if candidate and former Vice President Biden wins in November, our first stop will be with the allies. He has said that, and China will be, and a common approach to China will be one of the main issues at the top of the list to try to get our act together collectively.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That ties in nicely actually with one of the questions here from our viewers. I was just about to ask you, Omid, where do you see the main friction points really in the China policy transatlantically? So, you know, where are the points of disagreement? But to include here one of the questions from our viewers, how, to you, Omid, how do you predict the German government will handle China during its upcoming EU Council presidency? What are your expectations for the 27+1 leaders meeting in Leipzig?
I think the question of the friction has two parts. The first part has just been answered by Victoria. So let me focus on the European side. We are facing a dividing policy by the Chinese toward the European Union. This is why we talk about 16, now 17+1. They talk about 1 plus 16 and 17. And we are seeing a bunch of countries within Europe who are not willing to even raise their hand when it's come to the EU Council and to the question of condemning human rights, worst human rights violations in China. So, of course, it's sad to see that the American administration is not really understanding Europe and not be ready to cooperate in China when it comes to that. It's not only China. Let me quote a person from out of the administration I saw 2 years ago, 1 week after 2018, 8th of May, I think, when President Trump announced that the Americans going to withdraw from the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. 1 week after that, I was visiting one of the members of National Security Council in the White House. And when I was telling him that this is not that good for Europe, his answer was, and this is a question of sovereignty of German and European companies not to be targeted by secondary sanctions of the Americans. He answered, he was confused, saying, why are you talking about sovereignty? You are members of the European Union. So there is this huge misunderstanding or non-understanding of the nature and character of the European Union within the administration, which is bad. But we have our homeworks also. It's obvious that there are 2 or 3 countries which are helpful for the Chinese to divide us, then we have to face that also. But at the end of the day, if there is no way to find a consensus within the Council that Europe goes out and say, this is our policy toward China, and this is our offer for a cooperation with the Americans and with our American friends, then you need coalition of the willings within the EU on that. Then it's about France, Spain, and Germany to come up with an offer, and it did not happen. That did not happen for the last years, and that, I think, it has been a huge mistake. We have no idea how the Leipzig summit gonna take place. We just know that it won't be in August. This was the original plan of. But what we know is that Chancellor Merkel is gonna announce all of these answers on May 27th. On May 27th, she just said that a couple of hours ago, she's gonna tell us what's gonna happen with the presidency, what the plans are, what the schedule is, and then how the EU-China summit gonna take place and when. But it's obvious that it is not only about free trade on Chinese term. It's also not only about just opening the door for Chinese help for a European economic recovery after the pandemic. It's our job to push that the European Union and members of the European Union speak about the origins of the pandemic and speak about the human rights and the civil rights situation in China. In the shadow of the pandemic, a lot of people did not notice that the main part of the leadership of the opposition and the democratic opposition in Hong Kong is now under arrest. And of course, we know what's going on with the Uyghurs. So these are the issues we have to address, not only because it's our duty, but also because these are the weak points of their system. We have to talk about it.
I couldn't agree more with that. Let me just remind about one example, and I do think Germany has a huge leadership role to play within the European Union. When I was at NATO as ambassador 2005 to 2008, we started to see European countries considering selling high-tech weapons to China at a time when China was getting more and more aggressive in the South China Sea. And first at the NATO platform, but then in US-EU relations and in bilateral consultations with member states and in military-to-military channels, we, the US, went on a 9-month consultation education campaign with European countries and with the institutions to explain the dangers to our common security, but particularly to Asian allies' security of some of these systems getting into Chinese hands. And we were able first to pause the sales and then to come up with a common regime of what constituted high tech, what was lower tech and less worrisome and therefore could be traded. So we know how to do this work. We just have to get back to the hard work of doing it. And, you know, you are far from China, although it's a major export market. We are a Pacific country and our supply chains have been deeply enmeshed. So just as we did with sanctions against Russia after Ukraine, we have to really understand each other's issues, security issues, economic issues, political issues around these, and come and find that common set of actions that we can all take and everybody compromise a little bit. And we've lost the art of being able to do that, largely because my country's not trying, but also I would say because the EU is too fractured on some of these issues and particularly is at risk of I think, losing the democratic narrative inside the member states. You know, when Orban can do what he did in terms of emergency powers and suffer no consequences, when he can do what he's been doing over the last 4 years and still get billions of euros every year in EU cohesion funds right out of the German taxpayers' pocket, which he uses to prop up one-man rule. You know, he's clearly not meeting European democratic standards anymore. And the question is, what's Europe going to do to protect that internally? Now, I say that with all humility, understanding how much violence has been done to democracy in the United States and how much repair work we also have to do, but that'll be part of the work here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have already talked quite a bit about China and how China is at least, you know, trying to fill the vacuum. Now there's a question from my good friend Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council in Germany, so the co-host of this discussion here. To you, Omid, as a member of the Bundestag, do you have any thoughts regarding the recent revelations and indeed confirmation that Russia was responsible for hacking the Bundestag? You also wrote an op-ed recently on the situation in Russia and the domestic situation and tensions there. So what are your thoughts about, you know, Russia's attempts here to expand its spheres of influence and to hack the German IT infrastructure?
And can I pile on that question to Omid? If it's true, should there be consequences, and how would you propose that be executed?
This definitely should be, and this is a very unique, unfortunately not very unique, but a harsh act of a violation of our sovereignty we just cannot accept. My job as part of the opposition is not to spend due burden on my chancellor, but she found a very clear language yesterday at the floor of the Bundestag, saying that this is part of the hybrid warfare, of Russia against Europe and also Germany, and it's that there should have there are going to be consequences. The question is which consequences, and the answer is first, I don't know. Second, I'm hesitating to elaborate concrete ones, because I hope that my country does the same like the British did after Salisbury, just going to the EU institutions and find a common answer. And we know how these institutions are working, so it's better just to talk with the friends and partners and other members of the European Union and find a common solution, and not coming in with a very, very concrete idea, which is then could tackled by the other, or the others are not fitting to this, or other members say. But it's obvious that we need an answer, and it was a very bad move that there never had been an answer to the murderer in the Tiergarten. We had a similar case a couple of months ago where GRU, the military intelligence of Russians, killed a Georgian citizen in the middle of Berlin. And this guy is now, the murderer is now in prison, but there never had been political consequences of that. But there had been a very shy language of my government addressing this. Now it had changed, and this is good. And now it needs, obvious that it needs consequences. I think we need European solidarity, and we had to ask for, like the British did.
So, Victoria, what would be your view on that issue? I mean, of course, in 2016 we had a fierce debate in the US on meddling with the election. We are now, heading towards the 2020 election. It seems as if the corona pandemic is very much occupying public discourse. Is that still part of the conversation in Washington? The integrity of the election, ways to manipulate it through fake narratives and so on. So is that a topic that has kind of shifted to the background, or is it still, vividly discussed? What is your impression at the moment?
Well, first, just to underscore something that Omid said, I think one of the problems we've got as a democratic world is that this instance with the Bundestag happened in 2015, and we are 5 years later getting an official report. We just can't operate that way. We've got to have rapid attribution. We've got to have rapid reaction. I think, one of the reasons that Macron was so successful in his first election, in his election in defeating Russian attempts to meddle, was that in real time, in the same news cycle, he identified it publicly, called it out, and told his news organizations and his citizens to pay no attention to it. Look, I think in the United States, we have made significant strides to tighten up the physical, technical aspect of how we vote. So the vulnerability in individual states of the Russians or anybody else being able to do what they do at home, change votes between the voter and the counting. We've hardened a lot of that. Not enough, but a lot of it. I think where we are falling down on the job is on the influence campaigns, and the Russians have gotten much better. What they do now is, instead of coming up with their own campaigns from whole cloth, they jump onto existing cleavages in the political cloth of the country and try to exacerbate tensions. So you saw that even before the pandemic, being on both sides of Black Lives Matters issues and coming up with false groups of their own, et cetera. A lot of that we are catching now, but now they're using the pandemic and the very deep political cleavage in the United States about how to react to it to try to exacerbate tensions. All that said, we have to be vigilant. I do think our citizens have gotten a little bit better at recognizing garbage out there, and I do think the technology companies are getting better at taking down some of this stuff, particularly in response to the pandemic, but we're not strong enough. What I'm actually worried about with regard to the US election Yes, I'm worried about interference efforts, but the greater risk at the moment, unfortunately, is how are we going to vote in November? And are we going to come to a consensus across the political divide about standards? And the states control this, as in Germany. You understand this system. Your voting, I think, is federally mandated, but in our case, voting is state by state. But are we going to be able to ensure that there are adequate protections for mail-in voting, that efforts at voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement by Americans against Americans are defeated? We need to have significant early voting. We need to deal with the fact that older people are not going to want to come out of their houses. So how do you deal with that without skewing the vote? And then most dangerous of all, you probably saw in our news, folks like Jared Kushner a couple of days ago batting around the idea of changing the date, which is, just incomprehensible and inconceivable in our system. So we need to focus very strongly, and I know that the Democratic team is certainly focusing on this nationally and state by state, and how do we ensure complete enfranchisement in a safe and secure way for any American who wants to exercise his or her right.
Mm-hmm. If I may just follow up on that point very briefly, and we are approaching the end of our call, and I don't want to keep you for too long, but maybe just for particularly our German viewers, but I'm sure also the American participants would be interested in your perspective on how the Corona crisis will really play out in the election campaign or in the months to come. Has that really fundamentally changed the agenda? As no other topic ever before in US elections? Is it now all about Corona and its impact on the economy and on jobs? Have all other topics really shifted in the background? How has it impacted on the agenda or the discourse now in, before the election? Will everyone only look at the economy now? What will be the impact?
Well, as in Germany, most US elections, unless we're in an existential security moment, are about the economy. They're about, as Reagan used to ask, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, et cetera? What I would say is that the pandemic, and I think Omid made this point earlier, has exacerbated all of the issues and the tensions that we had before, and made, in the case of many American kitchen tables, these issues existential. It's interesting, as I said, I'm not in Washington now. I'm down in North Carolina, which is a far more conservative, red state part of the world than where I usually am. And you can really feel the political divide here in the response to the pandemic, with some people being extremely scared and extremely concerned that government hasn't gotten its arms around the health issues, that the economy is in free fall, that service workers in particular are suffering the most, that this unemployment support won't go on forever. Will their jobs ever come back? But in this state, a much larger percentage saying, this has been exaggerated. It's not that much worse than the flu. Why am I forced to close my business or shutter it? It's the liberals who are forcing the conservatives to take these measures. So I think all of the political cleavages that we have will play out in this election, including in the response. Is a top-down, trickle-down, take care of the rich and the big corporations first response, which is largely what we've had, better? Or do you need bigger government and more unity and more alliance in order to deal with these things, which is the traditional democratic approach to things? Now, I do think that we're starting to see some damage to the president and his party from this, partly because, his personal lack of empathy and some of the choices that he's made, both in terms of not taking preparedness steps in December and January and February as he should, and then denying the virus, and then suggesting that if you just drink bleach, you'll be fine, are beginning to have an effect on his numbers, including in some key constituencies like older people who just don't feel like he cares if they live or die. And also in, obviously, communities of color, which have been much more largely affected by this, and now in the farming community where the virus is starting to come across and affect also the ability to produce food and get it to market, et cetera. So we'll see. I think it will be all about the pandemic, but the pandemic is now all about everything.
Mm-hmm. Jerry, thank you so much. Omid, would you like to comment on that? Yeah.
I think one of the most important common battlegrounds in these days should be fake news and conspiracy theory. There is no day in these currently where I do not get at least 150 mails, some kind of conspiracy theories about Bill Gates plus. And I would love to see one of these nano chips we all got implemented. So you're now obvious about what he's saying. This is so crazy, and it's so crucial for democracies to counter fake news. Not only those who are organized and orchestrated, for example, not only, but for example, by the Russians. But to be honest, it's absolutely complicated to do so when the leader of the Western world is saying that maybe injection of disinfectant could help. So we have to find platforms on this. We have to find a way to cooperate on this, not only for the sake of Germans and Americans, but for the world. This is, look at what happened to the Chinese speaking or writing media in Australia. Had been an independent part of it had been completely erased because of the Chinese interference there. This is what is going to happen if you do not stand up quickly and coordinated, and if you do not cooperate on this. And this would be very helpful to find a way to work in this. But this is just repeat that. If there is a Twitter account having 65 million followers now, I think, spreading 12,000 lies in 2.5 years, this is not that easy.
Thank you, Omid. So certainly one of the many challenges that we share on both sides of the Atlantic and that we have to tackle in collaborative action. And I think this might be a good moment to actually come to an end for today's conversation. Thank you so much, both of you, Ambassador Victoria Nuland, Omid Nouripour, for joining this call. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and for taking the time. And thank you to all our viewers and listeners for taking part. This series of our German-American conference in its virtual form will carry on. And our mission, as well as the ACG's mission, is to keep the channels open in challenging times. Thank you so much, and all the best to both of you. Thank you. Goodbye.